My name is Gerald Miller, though most people who still remember me just call me Jerry. I turned 76 last week, not that anyone seemed to care beyond the standard automated birthday email from my insurance company. I live alone in a 3-bedroom brick house on the south side of Kansas City. It's the same house my wife Clara and I bought 50 years ago when we were just starting out, when our son Kurt was a colicky baby who kept us up every night, and our mortgage felt like a mountain we'd never climb. The mortgage is long paid off now, and the house is quiet. Too quiet. Most days I hear nothing but the ticking of the old wall clock in the kitchen, and the occasional creak of old floorboards settling beneath me like tired bones. Clara passed away 7 years ago. Cancer. Slow and mean. She fought with the dignity of a woman who'd never asked anyone for anything in her life, and she left behind a silence that never stopped echoing in these rooms. I keep her chair in the living room untouched, her books on the shelves in the order she left them, and her perfume bottle on the bathroom sink, though the scent has long faded. People say time heals. I think time just changes the shape of the whole. I used to be a high school history teacher. For 36 years, I taught American history to generations of teenagers, some of whom went on to become doctors, lawyers, real estate agents, one even a state senator. Occasionally, someone recognizes me at the grocery store, though that's rarer these days since I go out less and less, and says, "Mr. Miller, you made history feel real." That used to mean something to me. Now it just feels like an echo from a life I'm no longer part of. I don't have many visitors. My neighbors are mostly younger families, busy with soccer practices and mortgage refinancing, and posting vacation photos I never asked to see. My son Kurt calls me about once a month, usually on speakerphone with his wife Valerie chiming in the background. They live just 20 minutes away, but they haven't stopped by in almost a year. The last time I saw them was Thanksgiving, and even then, I could tell they were itching to leave before the turkey hit the table. I remember Valerie checking her watch every few minutes like she was late for a meeting. Their kids, my grandkids David and Brooke, barely looked up from their phones the entire meal. I tried to ask Brooke about college applications, but she gave me a monosyllabic answer and a look like I'd asked for her bank PIN. David said nothing at all. I suppose it's not their fault entirely. They don't really know me, and I suppose they've been told I'm old-fashioned, difficult, stubborn. Maybe I am. I don't go to church much anymore, though Clara and I used to attend every Sunday. After she died, I kept going for a while, mostly out of habit. But I started noticing how people would look at me, kindly, politely, but always with that thin sheen of pity in their eyes. They didn't know what to say. "You're holding up so well," or "She's in a better place now." Sentences that sound like answers but are really just attempts to dodge the awkwardness of grief. So I stopped going. Now my Sundays are just like any other day. Silent mornings, coffee brewed the way Clara liked it, with a pinch of cinnamon and the newspaper spread across the table, though I rarely read more than the obituaries and the weather. I stopped watching the news because it only seems to remind me how little the world cares for people like me anymore. The headlines are always loud and fast, everything moving forward like a train that forgot to stop for those left behind. No one wants to hear from an old man whose stories start with "back when I was your age." Even my doctor's office sends text messages now instead of calling, and when I went in for my last checkup, the young nurse referred to me as "sweetie" before asking if I had trouble remembering things. Sometimes in the quietest moments, usually at night when the house is dark and the silence is thick, I find myself wondering if I am already gone in all the ways that matter. I eat alone, sleep alone, talk to no one except the cashier at the pharmacy or the automated voice on my phone. I write things down now, passwords, appointments, grocery lists, things I never used to forget. I'm not losing my mind, but I know that I'm not as quick as I used to be. I sometimes catch myself talking to Clara out loud, as if she were still in the next room. I don't think it's madness, just habit. Habit and loneliness. There are entire weeks when the only phone calls I get are spam. My mailbox is mostly ads and Medicare brochures. Holidays come and go with a polite text from Kurt or a group message I'm barely included in. They say growing old is a privilege. But sometimes it feels more like being erased in slow motion. People forget you're still here, still watching, still remembering. Last week I sat alone in the living room on my birthday. I didn't tell anyone it was coming. Not that I needed to. The date has been the same since 1948. I made myself a small dinner, a bowl of canned soup and 2 slices of toast, and watched a black and white movie Clara used to love. No candles, no cake. I told myself I didn't mind. But the next morning, I opened the mailbox and found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a card from Valerie. "Happy 77th, Dad," it said in her handwriting, the same cold script she used on shopping lists. "Kurt and I want to celebrate with you. We've rented a cabin up north for the weekend. Fresh air, campfires, and quality time with family. We'll pick you up Friday morning." No explanation, no real warmth. Just an invitation written like an obligation. And yet, I stared at that card for an hour, reread it 10 times. I wanted to believe it was real. That maybe, just maybe, they remembered that I existed not only as a name on a checking account or a signature on a will, but as a father, as a man, as someone who once mattered to them. I placed the card on Clara's chair as if showing it to her. "Maybe they want to reconnect," I whispered, and even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure whether it was hope or foolishness I felt. Friday morning arrived colder than expected, the sky cloaked in a heavy grayness that hinted at late snow despite the calendar still insisting it was autumn. I woke up 2 hours before the scheduled pickup time, the sort of restlessness that comes not from excitement but from the uncertain hope that gnaws at your ribs like a dull animal. I shaved carefully, picked out what I thought were my neatest clothes. A clean flannel shirt, dark slacks, a soft cardigan Clara had knitted me before her illness stole her hands, and packed a small bag with essentials. My medication, a pair of walking shoes, a toiletry kit, 2 changes of clothes, and an old photo of Clara folded in the inside pocket of my jacket like a secret I wasn't ready to surrender. I checked the time obsessively, tidied the already spotless kitchen, watered the plants, and sat by the window, watching the street for any sign of their car. When Kurt and Valerie finally arrived, 40 minutes late, in their sleek black SUV, they didn't get out at first. I saw their silhouettes through the windshield, heads tilted toward each other in some kind of private conversation, and I wondered for a moment if they were reconsidering. But then Valerie stepped out briskly, wearing oversized sunglasses despite the cloudy morning, her lips drawn into the kind of forced smile you give to someone you don't want to touch, but must endure. "Hi, Dad," she said, voice too bright, too sharp, as if she were hosting a daytime TV segment called How to Talk to Difficult Elders. Kurt stayed in the car, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel, not even looking up. Valerie insisted on checking my bag. "Just to make sure you didn't forget anything important, Dad. You know how it is?" And when she saw the photo of Clara, she frowned slightly but said nothing. I asked if they'd like to come in for coffee before we left. Valerie glanced at her watch and shook her head. "We're already running late. It's a long drive." She didn't ask to use the bathroom or to sit or to see the house she had grown up in. Just picked up the bag and walked it to the trunk without another word. I locked the door behind me with an odd sense of finality, as if I might not be seeing it again for a long time. The drive began in awkward silence, the kind that settles in the air like static before a storm. Valerie sat in the passenger seat, typing furiously on her phone, occasionally giggling at something on the screen. while Kurt drove with one hand on the wheel, the other cradling a coffee cup with his name written on it in thick black Sharpie. I sat in the back seat, my knees slightly cramped, the heat vents blowing dry air across my face. I tried to start a conversation, asked about the kids, Brooke and David, but got only perfunctory answers. "They're good," Valerie said without looking back. "Busy. Brooke's in the drama club now. David's applying for internships." When I asked what kind of internships, Valerie sighed as if I were testing her patience. "Marketing, business, that kind of thing." The GPS voice interrupted every few minutes with directions, and each time it did, I felt more like luggage than a person. After a few hours, we stopped at a rest area, and while Kurt went inside to get gas station coffee, and Valerie scrolled through emails on her phone, I wandered a little, trying to stretch my legs. The wind had picked up, biting through my cardigan, but I welcomed the sting. It reminded me I still had nerve endings. When we got back on the road, Valerie finally turned in her seat and offered me a granola bar. "Here, in case your blood sugar gets low." I didn't want it, but I took it. Thanked her. She didn't respond. The cabin wasn't exactly rustic. It was more of a luxury rental, perched on a scenic ridge surrounded by artificially planted evergreens and faux lodge decor. 3 bedrooms, a hot tub, stainless steel appliances, and an enormous TV mounted above a gas fireplace that flickered with the push of a button. There were throw pillows that said things like "Lake Life" and "Unplug to Recharge," and a decorative sign in the kitchen that read, "Families are forever." I wondered briefly if the owners actually believed any of it, or just knew what sold to people, desperate for the illusion of warmth. Valerie showed me to my room, a small space off the hallway with no windows and a cot that creaked when I touched it. "We figured you'd want some privacy," she said, with a smile that never reached her eyes. I set my bag down, looked at the walls, bare, beige, indifferent, and sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, listening to the muffled laughter of Kurt and Valerie in the kitchen. There was something rehearsed in the way they moved, spoke, even smiled at each other, like stage actors locked into a performance they no longer believed in. Dinner that night was prepackaged lasagna heated in the oven, and a bottle of red wine Valerie opened with exaggerated flair. Kurt poured me a glass, but then switched it out for water before I could take a sip. "Just being careful, Dad," he said. "Wine and meds, you know." I hadn't had any medication that interacted with alcohol in years, but I didn't argue. I stared down at my plate and chewed in silence. Conversation drifted around me like I wasn't there. Valerie talked about a friend who had just bought a house in Scottsdale. Kurt mentioned some guy at work who got fired for being too sentimental with clients. I could have been a mannequin in that chair for all the attention I received. After dinner, they suggested a fire outside. "We brought marshmallows," Valerie chirped, producing a bag like it was some grand childhood treat. I followed them out into the chill, watched as Kurt built a small fire in the metal pit, sparks jumping like insects into the dusk. Valerie disappeared inside and returned a moment later dragging a black garbage bag. "We thought we'd make this symbolic," she said, her voice taking on a performative tone. "New year, new you." She reached into the bag and pulled out one of my old jackets, the tan corduroy one Clara had patched at the elbow years ago. "This thing is practically falling apart. Let's make space for the future." Before I could react, she tossed it into the flames. My voice caught in my throat. "What are you doing?" I asked, stepping forward, but Kurt put a hand on my shoulder. "Relax, Dad. Just old junk. You don't need any of it. We're going to take care of you now." Valerie pulled out more. Shirts, ties, an old tweed coat, a pair of worn slippers, and fed them to the fire like offerings to a god of forced reinvention. I watched in stunned silence as the clothes burned, familiar fabrics curling and blackening, buttons popping like tiny screams. I wanted to say something, to shout, but the words wouldn't come. The fire crackled louder than my pulse. The sky above us was endless and empty. At some point, they took out their phones and began filming. "This is going to go viral," Valerie said, giggling. "Grandpa's glow up." Kurt laughed too. I stood there frozen, smoke stinging my eyes, the smell of burning wool thick in my nostrils, unable to decide whether to scream or vanish. They were smiling, posing, laughing, so proud of themselves, and I realized in that moment that this wasn't about celebration. It was about erasure. They didn't want to honor my birthday. They wanted to delete me, starting with my clothes, my memory, my dignity. I turned away from the fire and walked back toward the cabin without a word. Inside, I sat on the edge of the cot in the windowless room and stared at the bag I'd packed, the things they hadn't yet destroyed, and I knew something with absolute clarity. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't love. It wasn't even family. It was something colder, and it had just begun. The next morning, I woke up in that windowless room with the unmistakable sensation that I'd been left behind, forgotten in a house that only pretended to be shelter. The air was stale, and the cot had pressed lines into my back like the creases of an old map, the kind no one uses anymore. My mouth was dry, and when I reached for the glass of water I had set on the nightstand, I found it gone. There was no sound from the rest of the cabin, no footfalls or clinking plates or low murmur of conversation. I waited for a while, unsure whether I was meant to stay put or emerge on my own. But eventually, I ventured into the main room where I found Valerie in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove with exaggerated energy. She looked up at me with a strained smile and said, "Oh, good, you're up. We were just about to have breakfast." Kurt was seated at the table with a tablet in hand, pretending not to hear me when I greeted him. He nodded absently, eyes locked on the glowing screen. Valerie placed a plate in front of me, scrambled eggs, burnt at the edges, and a piece of dry toast, and set a cup of coffee beside it black, though she knew I always took it with cream and 1 sugar. She didn't ask, and I didn't correct her. I forced the food down in silence, trying not to think about the smell of smoke still lingering faintly in my nose from the night before. Later that day, they announced they were going into town just for a bit, and suggested I stay behind to relax and enjoy some quiet. I offered to join them, saying I wouldn't mind a walk, maybe some air, and Valerie laughed lightly, almost too quickly, saying, "Dad, it's errands. Boring stuff, you'd just be waiting around." Kurt finally spoke, saying, "Besides, you didn't bring a jacket anymore, remember?" He smiled at his joke like it was clever. I said nothing. They left me there, alone in a house that wasn't mine, in clothes I no longer recognized as sufficient for the season, with no television remote, no reading material, and no internet password. I wandered from room to room like a ghost in someone else's afterlife. That evening, when they returned with shopping bags full of things for themselves, snacks, toiletries, some local wine, they offered me a paper cup of cold soup from a local deli and said, "Sorry, the line was long." They didn't ask what I'd done all day. Didn't ask if I'd eaten lunch or gone outside or even wanted to talk. Valerie put on a show and watched it with Kurt, laughing at things that weren't funny, and I sat in the corner like a piece of antique furniture too inconvenient to move but too expensive to throw away. It was during the second evening that the tone shifted again, subtly but unmistakably. We sat outside on the deck, the fire pit unused, the sky above dotted with indifferent stars, and Valerie began asking questions that didn't sound like questions. "Have you thought more about the assisted living options we talked about?" she asked casually, as if it were a shared project we had all agreed upon. I frowned, asked when we'd talked about that. "Well," she said, glancing at Kurt, We brought it up over Christmas, remember? It's just, we worry about you. You're alone in that big house, and well, you know how it is with stairs and all. I told her I was managing fine, that I still drove when I needed to, and that the doctor said my blood pressure was better than his. Kurt chuckled dryly and muttered, "If you say so." Valerie pressed on, saying that they had looked into a place not far from them, clean, quiet, lots of activities, good reviews. And if you sold the house, she said, tilting her head, you'd have plenty to cover the costs, plus some left over. I didn't say anything right away. I just watched the smoke rise from Kurt's cigar and wondered when my life had become a spreadsheet. The next morning, my medication was missing. I kept it in a small zippered pouch, always in the same part of my bag, and when I opened it, half the pill bottles were gone. I searched the room, searched the bathroom, even asked Valerie if she'd seen them. "Oh, maybe you misplaced them," she said, with that same syrupy tone. "I'll help you look later." Later never came. I skipped the pills that day, unsure which ones were gone, unsure how long I could go without them, unsure if I was being paranoid or if something far more intentional was at play. At lunch, Valerie asked if I'd been feeling confused lately, if I ever had trouble remembering names or dates or where I'd put things. "Just wondering," she said too quickly, "because some of the things you've said this trip, they've been a little off. You said Clara made that scarf, but I'm pretty sure I gave it to you for Christmas one year." I knew Clara had made that scarf. I remembered watching her knit it by the fire during a snowstorm, remembered how she had laughed when I tried to help and tangled the yarn. But Valerie smiled, like she knew better, and Kurt just nodded and said, "It happens to the best of us, Dad. No shame in getting some help." That night, I found a piece of mail in my bag that hadn't been there before. It was from a memory care facility, one I'd never heard of. Inside was a brochure, glossy and cheerful, with stock images of smiling gray-haired residents playing cards and baking cookies. Attached to it was a post-it note that read, "Just think about it, V." My heart sank. I sat on the cot with that brochure open on my lap and the smell of smoke still clinging to my clothes, and I realized this trip wasn't about celebrating my birthday. It wasn't even about family. It was a test, a grooming. An ambush disguised as concern. They were measuring my decline or trying to fabricate one, testing how much I remembered, how far they could push before I noticed the floor shifting under me. They weren't visiting me out of love. They were casing the property. I felt like a house marked for demolition. The next day when I asked to go into town with them again, they told me no. Valerie said I needed rest, that the altitude was probably messing with my head. "You don't seem yourself," she said, handing me a mug of tea already steeped and lukewarm. I asked what tea it was, and she said chamomile, but it didn't smell like chamomile. I only took one sip. Later, I noticed my legs felt heavy, and my thoughts drifted like leaves in a stream I couldn't quite swim against. I lay down in the middle of the day and woke up not knowing how much time had passed. When I checked the bag again, more things were missing. My extra wallet, a small notebook where I kept Clara's old recipes, my copy of the house deed I always traveled with just in case. I confronted Kurt that night. I said things were vanishing, that I was being treated like a problem instead of a guest. He scoffed and said I was imagining things, but his tone was different. Colder, less performative. "Dad," he said, setting his wine glass down with a soft clink, "maybe it's time we all accepted that you can't live on your own anymore. It's not safe. For you or for anyone else." I sat very still, afraid that any movement might shake loose what little control I still had over the moment. I told them I wanted to go home. Kurt laughed. Valerie said that wasn't possible, that they hadn't planned for that, that we still had a few more days here. I asked for my phone. They said it was charging, but when I went to look for it, it was gone. I asked for my credit card. They said it was in the safe, for security. I asked for my driver's license. Valerie smiled and said, "Don't worry about that right now." I looked at my son, and I didn't see a boy I had raised. I saw a stranger holding a set of invisible keys to a cage I hadn't realized I'd been locked inside. The walls of the cabin, once decorative, now felt padded. The windows, though clear, might as well have been barred. I went to bed that night with my heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with blood pressure and everything to do with betrayal. And in the middle of the night, when the house was silent except for the occasional shift of timber or breath of wind, I sat up and began to plan. Not just how to leave, but how to make sure that what they had done, what they were doing, would not go unanswered. They had set fire to my clothes, but I still had something far more powerful left to burn: their plans, their stories, their illusions. They thought I was weak. That age had made me fragile and forgetful, but I remembered everything. And that, I now saw, was what frightened them most. The morning I decided to disappear was quieter than the others. No rustling from the kitchen, no television murmuring in the background, no forced laughter bleeding through the walls, just that thick, unbroken silence that feels less like peace and more like absence, the kind that lets you know you've been truly left behind. When I emerged from the guest room, if you could even call that bare, airless cube a room, I found a note on the table in Valerie's handwriting. Running errands in town. Back late. Sandwiches in fridge. Don't wait up. No mention of what kind of errands, no apology for the abandonment, no warmth in the words. It was like reading a message left for a pet or a tenant, not for a father. I stood in the kitchen staring at that note, trying to decipher if they had already made their move or were still preparing for it. The fridge did, in fact, contain 2 sandwiches wrapped in plastic and an unopened bottle of orange juice. It looked like a school lunch hastily thrown together without affection. I closed the door, unopened. The air outside was sharp, filled with salt and wind from the sea just down the path. I hadn't ventured far from the house since we arrived, mostly because I had been implicitly discouraged from doing so. But now, something in me had shifted. The leash had frayed. I dressed in the layers they hadn't yet burned and stepped outside without telling anyone. The walk down to the beach was longer than I remembered, but each step away from the cabin felt like I was reclaiming something invisible they'd tried to strip away. Choice, movement, will. I sat on a bench overlooking the gray waves and thought about Clara. I imagined what she would say if she could see me like this, a man reduced to waiting for instructions from people who once called him Dad. With reverence, but now did so with weary condescension. I felt a sudden chill, not from the wind, but from clarity. I was not simply unwanted, I was in the way. I wasn't an elder to be cherished. I was an obstacle to be managed. Back at the house, I noticed something odd the moment I re-entered my room. My suitcase had been moved ever so slightly, not ransacked, not obvious, but the kind of subtle shift that only someone who'd packed it carefully would notice. I unzipped it and searched. My passport, which I always kept tucked into the inner lining, was missing. The envelope of emergency cash I had stashed there was still present, but thinned. $500 had become less. My wallet was intact, but when I opened it, the credit card I remembered placing there on the first day was gone. I checked twice, 3 times. Every pocket. Nothing. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. They hadn't just forgotten about me. They had robbed me, carefully, calculatedly. And I realized then with chilling certainty, this wasn't negligence. This was abandonment in progress. They were going to leave me here without ID, without money, in a town where I knew no one, in a house rented under their name, until I became someone else's responsibility. Or no one's at all. Panic nearly swallowed me. I sat on the edge of the bed with my hand over my chest, trying to steady the thumping. But after the panic came a quieter, sharper thing. Something older than fear. Something Clara would have called resolve. I wasn't going to wait for them to finish their plan. I wasn't going to sit still and let them write me out of my own story. I began packing what remained. My toothbrush, my extra socks, a weather-worn copy of a Louis L'Amour novel I kept for comfort. I emptied my wallet, counted the bills, just under $1,000. It would have to be enough. I found a local tourist map in the kitchen drawer, the kind with cartoon crabs and bolded hiking trails. At the very bottom was a small transportation icon, a bus station in town, about 3 kilometers away. If I could reach it, I might find my way out. I left the cabin by the back entrance, locking the door. With the spare key I had memorized from the day we arrived. I didn't know if Kurt and Valerie had already erased me from their future, or if they were waiting for some legal threshold, maybe a week of my silence to report me missing, to initiate guardianship, to produce paperwork that would make them stewards of my existence. But I wouldn't give them that time. I wouldn't give them the dignity of thinking I was passive. I walked slowly but deliberately toward town, past shuttered beach shops and cedar fences, past children building sandcastles on forgotten October beaches. The bus station was smaller than I imagined, almost apologetic in its presence, but inside it was warm, and the young woman behind the counter greeted me without hesitation. "How can I help you, sir?" she asked. As if I weren't the kind of man everyone else had started seeing through, I told her I needed to get to Kansas City, or as close to it as possible. She typed rapidly. "There's a bus to Portland in 2 hours," she said. "From there, you can connect through Minneapolis. It'll take a few days, but you'll get home." I nodded. "I'll take it." "Do you have ID?" she asked. My breath caught. I reached for my wallet and hesitated, then remembered. My driver's license, long unused, was still tucked behind my library card. I handed it over. She scanned it, smiled. "That'll do." When I left the station, ticket in hand, I stood in the weak sunlight outside and looked toward the horizon. I thought about what Kurt and Valerie would do when they returned and found me gone. Would they panic? Would they laugh? Would they report me missing and pretend they cared? It didn't matter anymore. I had enough cash to make it to Portland. I had my name. I had my steps. That would have to be enough. As I sat on the bench waiting for the bus to arrive, I opened my notebook, one of the few things I hadn't lost, and wrote 3 lines. They tried to erase me. I made myself visible. This is not the end. And as the bus pulled into the station and I rose to board it, I carried those words like armor. I was not done. Not by a long shot. The 3-day bus journey back to Kansas City unfolded in a blur of unfamiliar terminals, cold vending machine coffee, and sleepless nights spent trying not to think too hard about the weight of what had just happened to me. I sat near windows when I could, watching towns I would never visit flash by in silence, each one a reminder that I had been brought halfway across the country by people who no longer viewed me as human. It was a strange thing to realize that I had survived something. Not a car crash, not a mugging, not even an illness, but something more insidious, more personal. Something that had taken years to ferment quietly beneath the surface of family dinners and birthday cards. It wasn't just betrayal I was nursing. It was erasure, a subtle campaign to make me small, frail, unreliable, forgettable. But I hadn't forgotten. And now that I was returning, not as a helpless victim, but as a man determined to make things right, I carried a sense of grim purpose that steadied me through the fatigue, the nausea, the cold that crept into my bones, from sleeping bolt upright in plastic chairs surrounded by strangers. By the time the bus rolled into Kansas City's terminal, my body ached, my eyes were bloodshot, and my shirt clung to my back with sweat and grime. But my mind was alert, coldly focused. I had a plan now. I had clarity, and I had nothing left to lose. The cab ride from the station to my home cost more than I wanted it to, but I said nothing to the driver. I simply watched the familiar streets pass by, noting every change in the landscape. The new cafe where a hardware store used to be, the half-constructed condominium where Clara and I once bought plants from a weekend market, and felt both the comfort and alienation of a place that had continued living without me. When I reached my front door, I stood for a moment before unlocking it. The key slid in easily, and when I stepped inside, I was met with a smell of stillness, dust, sealed air, and faint traces of Clara's perfume lingering on the coat she had left hanging in the hallway a decade ago. I stood in the doorway for a long time before moving, letting the house remind me who I had been. And then I set to work. The first call I made was to my bank, and I asked to speak to Eleanor, the branch manager I had known for years. She greeted me with concern. Apparently, my daughter had reported my card lost and requested a block. I told Eleanor firmly that I was the card holder, that I had not authorized any such request, and that I wanted a full statement of recent transactions. When she read them to me, my worst fears were confirmed. Valerie and Kurt had withdrawn thousands in cash from ATMs along the Maine coast, attempted a large transfer to their joint account, and even purchased a new laptop and some kind of memory-enhancing supplement subscription that sounded like a front. I instructed Eleanor to freeze all accounts, cancel the card, and issue a new one to my address immediately. She asked gently if I was safe. I said yes, but I didn't elaborate. I wasn't ready to be anyone's case study. The second call was to my attorney, Mr. James Landry, a dry but reliable man who had handled Clara's estate and my will. I explained what had happened in plain terms. I believe they attempted to trap me, to manufacture signs of cognitive decline. They removed my documents, isolated me, restricted my freedom of movement. I believe they may try to declare me legally incompetent. Landry was quiet for a moment before replying. "Can you come in tomorrow?" he asked. "We should review your legal position immediately." The next day I sat in his office beneath framed certificates and dusty law books and explained everything. What they burned, what they stole, what they said, how they recorded me, laughed at me, how they talked over me like I was already fading. Landry asked a few clarifying questions, then opened a file from 8 years ago and slid it toward me. "Do you remember this?" he asked. I did. It was the co-ownership agreement for Kurt and Valerie's house. Back then, they had asked me to help with the down payment, claiming they couldn't secure the mortgage alone. Clara had just died, and I was so desperate to stay connected to someone that I agreed without hesitation. I remembered signing the papers, not really reading them, just trusting them. Landry tapped the document. "You're a 1/3 owner of the house," he said. "Fully listed. You have legal rights. They cannot sell or refinance without your consent." I felt something bloom inside me, rage, but also leverage. They had tried to erase me from the map, but they had overlooked the one place I was still legally tethered. I asked if I could sell my share. Landry nodded. "You can, but it's complicated. You can't force them to sell their shares unless we go to court. But you can list your portion. You can make their lives inconvenient." That word stuck with me. Inconvenient? That's what I had become to them. Now I could return the favor. Over the next few days, I worked quietly, methodically. I hired a real estate agent, A woman named Teresa, with sharp eyes and a warm manner. She met me at the house on Maple Lane, the one I'd never been invited to after signing the deed. And we stood across the street staring at it like it was a crime scene. "Can I go in?" she asked. "Not without their permission," I said. "But you can start the process, notify them, begin paperwork. I want the house sold, or at the very least I want them to feel the walls closing in." Teresa nodded, understanding more than I had expected. "We'll send the letter certified. They'll have 30 days to respond. If they refuse, we can escalate." I went home and made a list of everything they had taken, materially, emotionally, symbolically. I wrote down the name of every garment burned. I listed the medications they had hidden. I tallied the hours they had left me alone in that cabin, and then I began undoing their grip. I filed to revoke all power of attorney documents I had once granted Kurt. I contacted the DMV to begin a claim on the SUV he had parked at my property and left unused for over a year. A vehicle I had paid partial funds for, now legally vulnerable to an abandoned property claim. I visited the local notary and signed the forms to remove Kurt as beneficiary on my life insurance. I closed the joint account I had opened for Valerie during her college years, one she had quietly continued using as her personal piggy bank. There was over $20,000 in it, money I had deposited faithfully over 5 years, gifts she never acknowledged. I moved every cent into my name. When the bank teller asked if I wanted to notify the co-owner, I said no. I left the branch with a strange sense of satisfaction, as though I had reclaimed parts of myself brick by brick. The final step came when I found a small apartment across town. 1 bedroom, quiet neighborhood, lots of retirees. The kind of place where no one asks too many questions but everyone nods hello. I signed a lease, paid in full for 6 months, and arranged for my mail to be forwarded. I didn't tell anyone. I changed my number, my email, my emergency contacts. I let myself vanish. One morning, I sat at the window of my new place watching the light play across the lake, and I realized something peculiar. I no longer felt ashamed. For so long, I had blamed myself for raising a son who saw me as a burden, for not noticing Clara's exhaustion, for being too rigid, too quiet, too afraid of confrontation. But now, staring out over calm water in a chair I had chosen myself, I understood that survival sometimes meant letting go of the people who believed they owned your ending. A week later, Teresa called. "They received the letter," she said. "They're furious. Their lawyer called mine this morning, claiming you're mentally unfit, and the letter has no standing." I asked what came next. "We'll need a medical evaluation," she said. "It's standard in cases like this." "We'll prove you're of sound mind." I laughed for the first time in weeks. "Let's do it." The tests were invasive, tedious, humiliating in their own way. Memory recall, cognitive patterns, reflex checks, handwriting analysis. But I passed each one. The neurologist said my brain was slow, but functional. The psychiatrist said my emotional regulation was impressive for a man who had been through what I described. The gerontologist, a woman with tired eyes, shook my hand at the end and said quietly, "They tried to disappear you. That's common now. But you're not the kind who fades." I thanked her. And then I waited for the courts to validate what I already knew, that I was not broken, that I still had voice and paper and name. And when the ruling came through, clear, firm, unambiguous, I framed it. Not for pride, for proof. Because I knew the next stage would be harder, and I wanted to be ready. Let them come. Let them scream. Let them watch as I turned their dreams to dust, the same way they tried to burn down the last remnants of mine. I hadn't started this war, but I would finish it. The day of the final court hearing arrived cloaked in the kind of still, bright weather that feels falsely benign, as if the world itself had no idea that people were breaking inside buildings, hearts, and histories that day. I did not attend in person. My attorney, Landry, told me it wasn't necessary, and frankly, I didn't want to see their faces again. Not in the context of justice. I didn't want to give them the chance to perform grief, or outrage, or confusion. They had forfeited the right to be seen by me when they lit the fire under my memories and filmed it for their own amusement. I spent the morning in a quiet cafe not far from the courthouse, seated by a window where I could watch the calm repetition of cars moving through intersections, people walking dogs, commuters hurrying to jobs they'd someday look back on with either pride or shame. I sipped my coffee slowly, too slowly, each swallow bitter but grounding, while my phone sat on the table face up, waiting for the call that would either confirm or nullify everything I had done since stepping off that bus. The moment it rang, my hand shook not from fear, but from a deep internal vibration, the kind you feel when you're standing on the edge of something irreversible. "Mr. Miller," Landry said, his voice calm, clipped, legal. "The court has ruled in our favor. The sale will proceed. Your co-owners have 30 days to vacate the property. After that, forced eviction is authorized." I let out a breath I didn't know I had been holding and nodded slowly, even though he couldn't see me. "They didn't expect it to go this far," Landry added. "They thought their last-minute challenge of your mental competency would delay the process, maybe reverse it. But the judge didn't buy it. In fact, he reprimanded their attorney for submitting false or outdated medical documents." I thanked him, paid for my coffee, and walked out into the daylight, not with triumph, but with something sterner, older, closure with a pulse. 2 days later, it happened. I had gone out early that morning to the park near my new apartment, a habit I had developed to remind myself that life still contained things like wind and rustling leaves and bird song. As I was returning, the black SUV pulled up in front of the building too fast, tires grinding against the curb. Valerie was the first out, her eyes bloodshot, hair wild, clothes wrinkled in a way that suggested days of disrupted sleep and panic. Kurt followed slower, tighter, his face locked in that carefully neutral expression he always wore in moments of confrontation, like he was preparing to deflect blame with technicalities. I stood there, not moving, the keys to my building in one hand, grocery bag in the other, watching as they approached, like predators convinced their prey had gotten too bold. "How could you do this to us?" Valerie spat, her voice jagged with disbelief that had not yet hardened into fury. "You sold our house. You stole from us. You turned everyone against us. What the hell is wrong with you?" I blinked once, calmly, then turned and walked toward the small garden patio that lined the front of the building. "If you want to talk," I said without raising my voice, "do it somewhere civilized. There's a table over there." She followed, still muttering, while Kurt trailed behind like a lawyer sizing up the deposition room. When we sat, they didn't touch the menus the waitress brought. I ordered tea. Neither of them ordered anything. Valerie's hands shook as she gripped her purse like it might jump away from her. "We took care of you," she said, her voice pitching up. "We made sure you were safe. We cleaned your house. We checked on you. We invited you on that trip because we were worried. You burned my clothes," I said quietly. "You locked me in a house without my ID, without money, and without access to transportation. You recorded me, mocked me, and tried to convince me I was losing my mind." She opened her mouth, but I raised a hand. "Please, don't insult both of us by pretending it was anything else." Kurt finally spoke. "Even if we made mistakes, you didn't have to go nuclear. You didn't have to ruin our lives." I gave a small, humorless smile. You call what I did nuclear. I call it defensive. I didn't attack you. I stopped you from succeeding. Valerie slammed her hand down on the table. We're your family, she shouted. You don't treat family like this? I leaned in slightly. You're right. You don't. So ask yourself who stopped treating whom like family first. She looked away, jaw trembling. I saw tears in her eyes, but I didn't feel moved. I felt nothing for the woman sitting across from me, and that emptiness was more terrifying than any rage I had previously experienced. Kurt's voice lowered into something more calculating. You're not thinking long term, he said. You're old. You'll need support soon. Medical issues, bills. You can't handle everything on your own. Then I won't, I replied. But I'll face that end with dignity, not in a padded cell you paid for with my savings. He leaned back, crossed his arms. So this is it? You're cutting us off? No more contact? I looked at him directly, unblinking. You cut me off the moment you stopped seeing me as a father and started seeing me as a liability. Valerie's voice turned shrill. What about Brooke and David? They're your grandchildren. They haven't spoken to me in 3 years, I said. They didn't send a card. They didn't call. I am a concept to them, not a person. That's not my failure. That's yours. She stood up, knocking over her chair. You're going to die alone, she hissed. You're going to rot in some godforsaken apartment, and no one will care. I looked up at her and nodded once. And it will still be better than being surrounded by people who pretend to love me while plotting my disappearance. Kurt pulled her back, his face pale, and they left without another word, storming out past curious onlookers. I stayed, finished my tea, tipped the waitress. When I returned to my apartment, I changed my locks again, just in case. 3 weeks later, the house was sold. My third yielded over $230,000. The car claim was processed. I sold the vehicle in another town under abandoned asset law. The joint account closure was finalized. My bank account balance now reflected a number that didn't just represent money. It represented survival, autonomy, earned justice. I wasn't rich, but I was free. And in the weeks that followed, I found myself sleeping through the night for the first time in years. The kind of dreamless, undisturbed sleep that only comes when you are no longer afraid of who might be standing over your bed with a smile and a plan. It's been 7 months since I last saw my son or his wife. I suppose in their minds, I no longer exist. Not in any meaningful way anyway. They haven't tried to reach out again, no letters, no calls, no attempts at reconciliation. Perhaps they're still stunned that the man they once assumed was one long nap away from a nursing home turned out to have sharper teeth than they thought. Or maybe they're simply embarrassed, or angry, or both. I've stopped trying to understand them. I've stopped explaining their actions to myself in softer terms. I live in a small, sunlit apartment now, on the second floor of a quiet building near a park. It's modest, but clean, and every corner of it is mine. I have shelves lined with books I chose, not ones gifted as afterthoughts. I brew my own coffee, just the way Clara liked it, and I've even taken to talking to her sometimes in the morning, not because I've lost my mind, but because it comforts me to think she hears me in some way. I planted basil and rosemary in small pots on the windowsill. They're growing well. I take long walks. And there are a few people in the building I've grown fond of. Harold from 2A, who used to be an electrician, and Mabel from the 3rd floor, who makes the best shortbread I've ever tasted. We play cards on Fridays. No one here asks me what I plan to do with my estate. No one here treats me like a future burden disguised as an aging father. They just see me. And I think that's the thing I mourned most. Not the betrayal, not the money, not even the loss of family ties. It was the loss of being seen, being known, being something more than a wallet with memory issues. Sometimes I wonder what Kurt tells people now. Does he say I went senile? That I wandered off? That I was manipulated by lawyers? Or does he say nothing at all, letting the absence of my name become a kind of convenient ghost story they tell their children to explain why Grandpa never visits anymore? I've come to understand that there are some stories I don't need to hear the endings to. I control my own story now. I rewrote the last chapter before they could scribble it out for me. I've also been volunteering twice a week at the library, organizing old archives and teaching local teens how to research without resorting to search engines for everything. Some of them call me Mr. M. I like that. It reminds me of a time when I stood in front of chalkboards and spoke with authority, before my own son decided that my only remaining value was in what could be extracted or contained. And you know what? I've started writing again. Nothing fancy, just short essays, personal reflections. One of them was recently published in the Senior Center's newsletter. It was about resilience, about the invisible dignity of aging, and how the most dangerous thing a person can lose isn't mobility or memory, but sovereignty. On Clara's birthday last month, I visited her grave. I brought fresh flowers and told her everything, the whole story from beginning to end. I told her what they did. I told her what I did. I even read her the court's decision aloud. I stood there for nearly an hour, not crying, not raging, just talking to the one person who had always known me without requiring explanation. When I left, I felt something uncoil inside me. Not forgiveness, perhaps, but release. I no longer carry the fire of vengeance in my chest. I carry something quieter now. Justice happened, not loud, not explosive, not cinematic, but precise, clean, silent, like a page turning. I know that when the end finally comes, when the final breath leaves me, I won't be surrounded by those I once thought would care. But I also know that I will not die confused or manipulated or erased. I will leave on my own terms, in my own home, wearing clothes I chose, with a name no one else can claim, and that, in this world, is a victory. Perhaps the only one that matters.